Markdown. The report had been sitting on his desk for 11 days. Arev Thon knew this because he had moved it twice. Once to reach the war room dispatches beneath it. Once to clear space for the ceasefire terms he had spent 3 years refusing to read. It was thin, 7 pages. Filed by a junior analyst named Duvith, whose clearance barely extended to the outer corridors of fleet intelligence. The cover notation read, Debris Field Somara, Supplemental Pattern Analysis, Variance Anomaly, Radial Distribution. He had not opened it. He knew what the Somara was. He knew who had killed her. He set his palm on the cover and held it there for a moment. The way a man might press a wound he has no intention of examining. Then his aide struck the door chime twice, and the question of Duvitha's report dissolved into the larger, more immediate question of what to do with the human. The human had arrived in a stolen Kasorath lander. That alone should have produced a summary execution in the bay. Nearly had. The watch captain had a weapon drawn when Silira walked in front of it. That was the kind of decision that didn't survive review. Putting a king's daughter between a guard's aim and an unidentified alien intruder. The watch captain was still writing his explanation, presumably. The human stood in the center of the receiving chamber. Wrists bound in field cord behind him. Breathing in the shallow, controlled way of something that had recently been running hard. He watched the doorway with the particular attention of a man who has spent time calculating which exits actually open. Arev Thon entered. The human did not bow. Ignorance or contempt, Arev Thon found, to his mild surprise, that he did not care which. He had expected to feel anger upon seeing the creature. What he felt instead was the sensation of standing at the edge of something whose depth he could not yet determine. 3 years of policy had made the humans abstract. This one was disconcertingly specific. Middle height, dark-haired. A cut along his jaw still moving through its first purple stage. Wearing the collar markings of a scout rank Arev Thon did not have a name for, because he had spent 3 years declining to learn them. Silira stood to the side, arms folded in a posture she'd inherited from him and turned into something harder. She looked at Arev Thon with an expression that said, I know what this looks like. I also know something you don't, and I need you to wait. He had not seen her in 19 months. She had been on the border. She had come back on a stolen human ship with a bound human prisoner. And she was asking him to wait. Daughter, he said. Father. A pause shaped like an apology. He found me in the wreckage of the Thesora, before your fleet did. The Thesora was confirmed destroyed. The secondary hull section wasn't. I had 6 hours of air and no propulsion. She glanced at the human, a look that carried some internal vocabulary Arev Thon didn't have access to yet. He deviated from his patrol corridor to reach me. Why? He says the distress beacon was wrong. The human, Marcus, his collar notation read, Colonel Marcus Shen, shifted his weight from his left foot to his right. The movement looked like impatience, except that his eyes didn't move with it. His eyes stayed on Arev Thon's face. Whatever the weight shift was, it was not impatience. Arev Thon looked at the human and waited. The translator unit at Silira's collar rendered the pause flat. The human seemed to understand it regardless. A distress beacon that has taken impact damage before it activates broadcasts differently than one triggered by a crew under normal emergency protocol, Marcus said. Yours was damaged before it fired. But the debris around the Thesora section was too clean for that kind of impact. He stopped there. He did not elaborate. He watched Arev Thon's face with the same stillness as before. The account was sufficient. Arev Thon recognized this with the particular clarity of a mind trained to recognize it. The explanation resolved the question it was asked to resolve. A human had detected an anomaly. The anomaly had indicated a survivor. The human had deviated to investigate. The account closed. And yet his daughter was standing across the room. Arev Thon had read hundreds of complete accounts. He had built 3 years of policy on complete accounts. The account in front of him was complete, and he found himself unable to file it. He did not know what to do with the space that left. Sethvar had no category for a resolved account that continued to produce consequences. He looked at the human for another moment. Then he looked at Silira. What did he find? Arev Thon said. When he investigated. Me, she said. And evidence that someone else had already been through that wreckage. She said it simply. She did not explain it. She watched his face, the expression of someone waiting to see which way water runs. Take him to the East Wing, Arev Thon said. A sealed room. He is not a prisoner, but he is not free. Feed him. He paused. I will speak with him further in the morning. His aide found him an hour later. Your Majesty, the human is asking for writing materials. Arev Thon looked up from the war room dispatches he had not been reading. He said. The aide checked his notation pad, reading with visible discomfort. He said he needs to document his patrol deviation before the details begin to drift. He said, specifically, that if anyone later needs to prove he acted without orders, he wants the account written in his own words within 48 hours of the event, because that's when human memory is most verifiable. Arev Thon sat with that for 3 seconds. A man who had violated standing orders, and then voluntarily generated a contemporaneous record of the violation, before the details begin to drift, as if the account's value diminished with clarity, as if a thing written close to the confusion was worth more than a thing written after the confusion had been sorted. Give him the materials, Arev Thon said. He returned to his study. The report was still there. Debris field Somara supplemental pattern analysis. He sat down and did not open it. But he looked at it for longer than he had in 11 days. His daughter had mentioned debris patterns. His daughter had survived because a human had looked at a debris field, found the wrong answer in it, and kept looking. He thought about the Somara, his wife's diplomatic transport, 212 crew, obliterated above the contested station at Kelvin Reach 3 years ago. The evidence had been immediate and overwhelming. A human military patrol in the sector. Weapons residue consistent with human ordnance. Hull damage consistent with an external kinetic strike. Fleet Command had assembled the case in 48 hours. He had read it once and closed it, because it told him what the evidence told him. And the evidence was not ambiguous. And he had loved her. And the closed case was the only solid thing he had left to stand on. He had built the last 3 years on that floor. Duvitha's report was 7 pages. The cover notation said variance anomaly. Not contradiction. Not refutation. Just a small word meaning that a number was slightly different from the number it should have been. He pressed the report flat with one hand. With the other he pulled the war room dispatch board toward him. He did not open either. He sat in the space between them, in his own private dark. Silira came to him at the 4th evening bell. The study had gone dark except for the desk lamp and the pale strip of light under the eastern garden door. He had ordered that garden sealed 2 months ago, after the anniversary. He didn't go in. He kept the light on because the alternative was darker. She sat across from him without ceremony. The way she had when she was young, before the ceremony had layered itself over everything. She looked like someone who had survived something and was still deciding whether to be grateful or furious about it. He's not what I expected, she said. No. She was quiet for a moment, touching the side of her neck where the impact bruising from the hull collapse was still visible in faint yellow gradients. When the breach opened, he is a foreign military asset in a sealed room. He is the only person within this palace who has a specific professional history of looking at evidence that accounts for an event and asking why it accounts for it so perfectly. She laid her fingers on the report without touching it, a gesture she had inherited from him. He flagged the Somara pattern in the first hour. He has documentation. His own commanders found it insubordinate. The word landed precisely. Arev Thon looked at the report, then at his daughter. His military record. I want it. I have it. He questioned the Somara assessment. Within 90 minutes of the event, she held his gaze. The objection is in human military archives, dated and time-stamped, 3 years before anyone had a motive to fabricate it. He waited. It isn't the only one, she said. He has filed formal dissents against confirmed conclusions before. His commanders called it analytical insubordination. 3 notations. She paused. One of the objections was correct. One was not. He looked at her. She held his gaze and said nothing further, which meant she was leaving something to him. He took it. He filed them both the same way. Yes. Without knowing in advance which would prove out. Yes. She watched him. He didn't tell me that to recommend himself. He told me because I asked about the incorrect one. Arev Thon looked at the report on the table between them. A man who had raised an objection that turned out to be wrong, and had apparently considered this neither vindication nor embarrassment. Only information about whether the question had been worth asking before anyone knew the answer. He did not say that aloud. He did not need to. Who wrote the original debris assessment? Commodore Tulrin's team. Signed off through Vesik's office. There it was. He felt the floor do something beneath him that the floor had not actually done. A recalibration rather than a movement, the world staying still while his understanding of its weight shifted. He sat down in the reading chair, which still held the slight indentation from the report he had apparently been sitting on when Silira placed it there. Vesik has requested 3 calendar meetings this month, he said. I know. He wants to brief me on the Eastern Theater expansion. He has been pressing the timeline for 40 days. Yes. He looked at her. You think he knows about Juvatha's report? I think archive routing is something Vesik's office has oversight of. She pulled the chair from the desk and sat across from him, close enough that he could hear her breathing work against the bruising when she moved. I think standard channels are something Vesik's people monitor. I think a junior analyst sending debris variance numbers that shouldn't exist through standard archive routing is something that produces a very particular kind of flag. Then Juvath may be in danger. Juvath is already in a different building. She said it flat, without elaboration, which meant she had already handled it. He studied her face. The angle she'd had since childhood, now sharpened by whatever had happened in that wreck, and felt something that was almost painfully close to pride. Tell me about the human, he said. She took a breath. He didn't rescue me. He found me. There's a difference, and he was careful about it from the first. He laid out what he knew, what he could infer, and where his inference stopped being reliable, and he stopped there. She paused. He has a navigational record from the patrol. He's been carrying it since the deviation, before the distress signal, before any of this. It documents why he was in the sector. He told me about it in the 4th hour. If it documents his presence, it also documents that he was unauthorized. He knows. She met his eyes. He volunteered that twice. He said, document the deviation, document everything, because the value of his testimony is that it comes with receipts, not because it flatters him. He said if the record were clean, it would look manufactured. He wants the record to show a man who broke protocol and then told the truth about it immediately. Arev Thon pressed his thumb against the edge of Juvatha's report. The paper was heavier than standard. Juvath had used sensor grade stock, which was either thoroughness or anxiety or both. What does the record show? She was quiet for a moment. He said I should hear that from him. In his own words, with his documentation in front of us both. She held his gaze steadily. He said the record has to be read in sequence. That the sequence matters. He looked at her. She looked back. Something in the set of her expression told him she agreed with that condition and had already decided she would not override it. He did not ask her why. He understood why. If she had already concluded the official record was wrong, then whatever the navigational record contained, it needed to arrive in the room unreduced. Not summarized by her, not filtered through his prior knowledge, not made to fit an account before the account was finished. She was protecting the sequence the same way she had protected the evidence in the landing bay. He understood that without her explaining it, which told him she had already learned something from the human that she was choosing to demonstrate rather than describe. He is a foreign military asset in a sealed room, he said again. But the weight was different now. Yes. And he has requested to speak with me. He has not requested anything. He is waiting. She lifted her chin slightly. I told him you would come when you were ready. He said, tell him there's no urgency. Then he asked what time the morning meal was served. Arev Thon rose from the chair. He walked to the window. The garden below was still dark and sealed. The gates pulled across the eastern path. He had ordered it closed 11 days after Somara. He could not now say exactly why, only that the sight of it had become unbearable, and the solution had been to eliminate the sight. Vesik will request the morning session calendar tomorrow, he said to the glass. He will request it at the 7th bell. And if I grant it, he will press for the authorization on the eastern expansion, which requires my seal. He watched his own reflection. If I do not grant it, he will know something has changed. Yes. He is not a fool, Scylyra. No. Her voice moved closer. She had crossed the room without him hearing her move. He's brilliant. He constructed something that satisfied every standard of proof we have on every surface. He built a case the way our minds expect cases to look, and our minds closed around it and held. She stopped beside him. In the glass, her reflection stood at his shoulder. But he had to satisfy Sethvar himself. His own mind runs the same checks ours do. He built this case and then he closed on it. And somewhere in that case there's a gap he couldn't see, because he stopped looking the moment it was sufficient. The navigational record. Possibly. She watched the garden. That's what Marcus thinks the sequence will show. But he said he won't know until the record is in the room. She paused. He said, I know what I preserved. I don't yet know what it proves. Those are different things and I won't pretend otherwise. Arev Thon turned from the window. I know. Not through an interpreter. Not with a security detail in the room. That will require you to override the custody protocol. She watched him, which Vesek's office helped draft. He held her gaze. Yes. I'll arrange it, she said. 7th bell. Before Vesek's request reaches your calendar. He nodded once. She moved toward the door, and he called after her, Scylyra. She stopped. The landing bay. When they brought him in and Commodore Orvith wanted to move him to secured hold, you countermanded it directly. Yes. That was before you understood what he knew. She turned partway toward him. Yes. Why? She was quiet for a moment. The bruising around her shoulder pressed visible lines into her expression. Because he was the only person present who could testify to what actually happened, and I had already decided the official record was wrong, and if I let them put him in secured hold, the record would be the only thing left. She held the doorframe. I wasn't protecting him. I was protecting the evidence. She left. He listened to her footsteps diminish down the corridor. Then there was only the sealed garden and Duvitha's report and the distant, specific terror that the worst thing he had done in 3 years was not the war. It was that he had loved his wife so completely that grief had become a room with no windows. And someone had built a door in that room and walked in through it while he was not looking, and aimed him like a weapon at people who had never fired the shot he had been pointing at for 1,000 days. Vesek received the message at the 3rd bell. He read it standing at the desk in his private office, where the light was always kept low because he thought better without strong shadows. The message said the king's morning calendar was filling ahead of schedule. Vesek's briefing would need to reschedule to a later session. He set the message wafer down on the desk. He picked it up. He read it again. The phrasing was standard. Administrative routine. The kind of rescheduling that happens 6, 8 times a month in a palace managing a multi-system conflict across 3 active theaters. Nothing unusual in the language. No irregularity in the routing. No mark of origin beyond the calendar secretary's standard seal. He set the message down and stood at his desk for 3 minutes by the clock on the wall, without moving. Then he crossed to the secondary communications panel and keyed a frequency that did not appear on any palace log. The response came in 11 seconds. He did not waste words on it. He said, "Find out who has accessed the Somara archive in the last 6 days and give me names within the hour." He closed the channel and stood in the low light. He felt the particular alertness of a man who has built something very carefully and is now listening to the structure for sounds he cannot yet identify. The Eastern authorization required the King's seal before the next session of the Border Council. The Council convened in 12 days. Convening without the authorization would require explaining its absence, which would produce questions he was not yet ready to answer. 12 days. The human was in a sealed room. The princess had been isolated, her communications monitored. The debris report had moved through archive routing 2 months ago and generated no visible response. He had checked. He had been checking. The case was closed. He was 63 years old and he had never been wrong about a closed case. He did not believe he was wrong now. He believed something had shifted in the air. He needed to know the exact direction of the wind before he moved. He needed the king's seal in 11 days. And he needed to know which name appeared in the archive access log. He walked to the window. Below his building, the palace's northern administrative wing was dark. East of it, the sealed garden. He had been the one to suggest closing it, in the weeks after Somara, when Arev Than's grief had been raw enough to require management. It had seemed like kindness. It was kindness. The two things could coexist. The frequency chimed. He crossed back to the panel. The name on the access log was not the princess. It was not an intelligence analyst, a records officer, or a border council aide. The name was Juvith T. Junior Systems Analyst. Debris Division. Accessing the Somara Primary Sensor Archive 41 days prior. Processing time, 2 hours and 17 minutes. And then, 6 days ago, Arev Than, king of the Kasorath Empire. Accessing the same file. Processing time, 11 minutes. Vesic closed the channel. He remained at the panel with his hand flat on the surface and considered the 11 minutes. This was the part that required precision. There were two possibilities. The first, the king had reviewed the archive out of grief, the way he had done twice in the first year, old attachment to a closed case, nothing more. The second, the king had gone to the archive with a question, which was a different thing entirely. A man who visited a closed archive with a question was no longer observing a closed case. He was reopening the ledger. The distinction mattered because the case itself was complete. Every element resolved. The debris surfaces, the variance data in the original assessment, the human ship's positioning, the timeline. He had built it with attention to exactly this kind of subsequent examination, checking each piece against the standard of review his own mind applied to closed accounts. It had held. It would hold now under any review that started from the account itself and worked outward. The difficulty was a review that did not start from the account. He had considered this in the construction phase and determined it was not a practical risk. Not because such a review was impossible, but because Sethvar made it functionally improbable. You could not sustain a Kasorath investigation by refusing to accept a sufficient account as its own starting point. The mind did not hold open questions open indefinitely. The architecture did not support it. A reviewer who rejected explanatory completeness as a criterion had no ground to stand on. Except the human. A man in a sealed room with no communications access and no standing in Kasorath proceedings was a man who could not act, whatever he knew or suspected or had documented. Vesic had concluded this 10 minutes after receiving the first report of the human's arrival. He had not revisited it. The account was closed. He straightened. He went to his desk. He pulled the Eastern authorization draft from the locked drawer and set it on the surface where he could see all 4 pages. 12 days was not enough time for a formal investigation to proceed to anything actionable. It was, however, enough time for a seal. He did not need to know the direction of the wind. He needed the document signed before the wind made a decision for him. He would request the calendar meeting again at the 7th bell. He would not explain the urgency. Urgency explained was urgency that required justification, and justification required him to locate the precise source of the problem before he could present his counter-narrative. He had not yet identified the precise source of the problem. He knew what the problem was not. It was not the princess, monitored, injured, isolated with a foreign soldier she had no formal way to communicate through. It was not the debris report. A junior analyst's numbers without context were not an indictment. It was not the human. A man in a sealed room with no communications access and no standing in Kasorath proceedings was a man who could not act, whatever he knew or suspected or had documented. The problem was the king reviewing the archive. 11 minutes of Arev Than looking at something he had not looked at in 3 years. 6 days after the human arrived. Vesic did not believe in coincidence. Coincidence was what people called evidence they hadn't yet assembled into a pattern. He needed the seal. He wrote the calendar request in his own hand, without a secretary, and sent it through the formal channel at precisely the 7th bell, as the first light pressed under his office door. He waited. The response came back in 4 minutes. The morning session was full. The king would be unable to accommodate an additional briefing until a time to be determined. Vesic read the message 3 times. Then he folded it carefully, put it in the locked drawer beneath the Eastern authorization, and began to reconstruct, from the beginning, every element of the case he had built. He was not looking for a flaw. A flaw would have surfaced in the original construction, and he did not make that kind of error. What he was looking for was something narrower and more difficult. An element he had accepted as closed before the account around it was truly complete. A place where his own certainty had run the check and the check had returned sufficient and he had moved on correctly by every criterion he possessed, but where sufficient and true were not, in fact, the same thing. He did not find it. But somewhere in the palace, in a sealed room no one was watching closely enough, a man who had never been able to leave sufficient evidence alone was writing down everything he knew. Mark down. The 7th bell had not yet rung when Arev Thon reached the lower corridor. He arrived outside the sealed room ahead of his own guard rotation. By design. For steps behind him, Silira moved without the ceremonial spacing protocol. The protocol that governed every other approach to the king in motion. She had stopped observing it sometime in the 2nd year of her absence. He had stopped expecting it the night she came home. The corridor ran beneath the administrative quarter. Stone-floored and narrow, lit by fixed wall strips that hadn't been calibrated since the previous rain. The light sat yellow and flat against the walls. Arev Thon could feel the cold through his court shoes. He had dressed quickly, without ceremony. The cold was oddly clarifying. 2 members of his personal household guard stood at the room's door. Neither Vesik's configuration. He had checked the rotation manifest himself at the 5th bell, standing at his own desk with his finger on the roster line, reading it twice. The guard on the left, Orith 7, a designation he had approved personally, pulled the door latch without being asked. The king was not accustomed to rooms that opened before he signaled. He found he was grateful for it. Marcus Shen looked up from the small table. He had been writing. The table held a lamp, a cup that had gone cold, and approximately 30 pages of close-printed documentation. Arev Thon registered the volume before he registered anything else. A quantity that spoke to anxiety or precision or both. The human's face carried the particular exhaustion of a man who had been sleeping in intervals rather than fully. One eye focused slightly ahead of the other when he stood. He stood immediately, chair scraping back, and did not attempt to hide the pages. Silira closed the door behind them. Orith 7 would hold the corridor. Arev Thon crossed to the table without preamble and turned 3 pages face up without asking. The handwriting was dense, the notation system unfamiliar, human military shorthand, from the structure of the margins. Yet the intent was legible. Timestamps, coordinate clusters, a debris pattern diagram rendered with enough geometric precision that an analyst with no engineering background could have followed the argument. The human had been making a case. For 3 days in a sealed room, with no guarantee anyone would read it, he had been making the case anyway. Your orbit deviation, Arev Thon said. His Kasorath was court standard. He made no adjustment for the translation lag Marcus would be running. I want to understand when you made the decision. Before the Somara incident or after? Marcus's hand moved toward his jacket. The inner left panel, Arev Thon noticed, the motion of someone reaching for something carried close and then stopped. Not hesitation. Discipline. He was waiting for explicit permission. Show me, Arev Thon said. The navigation fragment came out. It was a physical data chip, smaller than Arev Thon had expected. Scratched along one edge in a way that suggested it had been handled repeatedly rather than stored carefully. Marcus set it on the table with his palm flat beside it rather than handing it across. I need an interface, Marcus said. Your format or mine? Mine's faster. I have the reader on me. Silira produced her personal reader from her sleeve pocket and held it out. Arev Thon watched Marcus take it and register briefly that it was already powered and already set to display human data architecture. Silira had prepared the reader before they left her apartment. She had been ahead of this moment by at least 2 hours, which meant she had been ahead of him. He filed that away. The interface populated in 12 seconds. A navigation log, timestamp rooted, with a cryptographic signature rendering as a column of verification characters down the right margin. Arev Thon was not a technical reader of such documents, but he recognized the structure from 3 years of contested sector briefings. The column meant the entry had been logged in real time by the craft's own navigation system without human override capability. A man could falsify a written report. He could not falsify the column. My standing orders placed me at grid reference 47 Kelvin at the time of the Somara incident, Marcus said. He moved his finger to the timestamp, did not touch the screen, just indicated, and then moved it to the coordinate cluster below. I deviated 22 minutes before the Somara beacon activated. The deviation is documented here. The reason for the deviation is documented in my written account. He gestured at the pages on the table. I ran the second test on my route assignment. Arev Thon looked at his daughter. Silira said, "He does it before things happen, not after. That's the record." Arev Thon returned to the log. 22 minutes. The Somara beacon had activated, the initial alert that triggered the border incident, that brought the Kasorath fleet command to its current war posture, and Marcus had been off his assigned position before the activation occurred. His presence near the Somara field was anomalous to his own orders before the incident gave him any reason to be there. If he had manufactured a rescue narrative after the fact, he would have placed himself on his assigned route and then constructed a reason for deviation. This was the opposite. This was a man who had already moved before the story he was supposedly constructing had happened. "You deviated because the route felt too clean," Arev Thon said. "I deviated because my assigned route placed me at exactly the right distance to serve as a credible incursion vessel if anything happened in the Somara sector within that window. My route assignment arrived 16 hours after a request went through border logistics for a patrol configuration in Kelvin Reach. I didn't know who made that request. I still don't." Marcus's voice was steady, but his hand had come to rest flat on the table. Pressure from the palm. Arev Thon recognized it from his own body under sustained stress. "I have the route assignment timestamp in the documentation. Page 19. Arev Thon turned to page 19 without looking away from the man's face. He found it by feel. He did not look down until he had taken the measure of Marcus's expression. It carried something he had learned to read in 3 years of human diplomatic contact and had always found difficult to name. The specific tension of a person who has been right before and paid for it, hoping to be right again in a room that might not let him. He looked down. The route assignment timestamp was there. Logged, verified, 2 columns of authentication. The request for Kelvin Reach patrol configuration, filed 16 hours prior. The requester field was encoded in standard border logistics cipher, as all such requests were, but the request carried an authorization string. A long one. Redundant by the standards Arev Thon recognized from his own administrative apparatus, as if the requester had applied a higher clearance level than the request actually required. He knew the clearance tier that string represented. He knew which members of his council held it. There were 4. His chamberlain, his fleet commander, his own daughter, and Vesik. Arev Thon set the page down with both hands carefully, because his hands were not entirely steady and he was aware of it. The stone floor was cold through his shoes. The lamp on the table threw yellow light that made everything look like evidence. He was still looking at the authorization string when the door opened. Orith 7 did not open it. The latch turned from outside, and Arev Thon understood before he had fully turned that Orith 7 had not had a choice. For guard uniforms entered in a column, not his household configuration, Vesik's color at the collar. Vesik himself came last, unhurried, reading something on a folded document as if he had arrived to attend to routine administration. "Majesty," Vesik's voice was warm and entirely controlled. "I apologize for the hour." When the archive access logs flagged an unscheduled review of the Kelvin Reach patrol configuration, protocol required a security assessment. The human is under open documentation order. He looked at Marcus with the expression of a man noting an accounting error. "He'll need to come with my guard while the assessment is completed." The 4 guards had not drawn weapons yet. They were positioned as though they had not needed to. Arev Thon said nothing. He was watching Vesik read the room. The pages spread on the table, the navigation chip, the powered reader in Marcus's hand, and watching Vesik's face stay smooth through all of it. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. Marcus had not moved. He was standing with both hands visible, the reader held loosely, watching the guards with the flat attention of a man calculating distances he had already decided not to use. "The documentation order is mine," Arev Thon said. "I issued it." "Of course." Vesik set the folded document on the table without unfolding it. But the security assessment exists independently of the documentation order, Majesty. If the human has produced materials that reference Kasorath operational logistics, the materials themselves fall under fleet review, regardless of who initiated the conversation. He paused. This is standard procedure. I'm certain you understand. Sylira said, from beside the secondary communications panel, he's going to ask you to step outside while the assessment is conducted. Vesic looked at her. The assessment will be brief. The assessment will be long enough, Sylira said. The two guards nearest Marcus moved. Not to arrest, to stand where an arrest would happen next if the room did not resolve cleanly. Their hands had not gone to their weapons. They were positioned so that the motion would take less than a second. Marcus looked at the guard on his left, then at the guard on his right. Then he looked at Vesic. Something in his face had gone to a particular stillness that Arev Thon had not seen before. Not fear, not defiance. The quality of a man who has arrived at a decision by a route long enough that the arriving is almost restful. He sat down. He set the reader on the table and placed both hands flat on the surface, beside the pages, and looked at Vesic. The maintenance record for reactor housing Unit 7 aboard the Somara, he said. Do you remember marking it resolved? The room's temperature did not change. The guards' positions did not change. Vesic's expression did not change. But Arev Thon had been watching Vesic for 11 years and knew the particular quality of a stillness that was not ease. Records are marked resolved when they are reviewed and found to require no further action, Vesic said. This is standard procedure as well. The record flagged an interior pressure variance consistent with a detonation accelerant insertion, Marcus said. His hands had not moved from the table. It was marked resolved before any physical inspection was conducted. The variance fell within acceptable engineering tolerance, Vesic said. The reviewing authority made that determination. Whose authorization string is on the resolution order? Vesic's expression shifted then. Not collapse, not panic, but the very slight adjustment of a man who has been asked a question he expected and had already constructed an answer for. Authorization strings on administrative documents reflect the clearance level of the reviewing authority, not necessarily the individual who acted. A string of that tier would appear on any resolution processed through the Eastern Administrative Channel during that period. The record was reviewed. The determination was made. The process functioned exactly as designed. It was a good answer. It was, Arev Thon recognized with a cold clarity, the right answer for a room governed by Sethvar. Two valid administrative states existed, and the presence of the authorization string in both simply meant that the Eastern Channel had processed both. The contradiction was not contradiction, it was administrative coincidence, the ordinary overlap of institutional machinery. Vesic had named a legitimate context, and the legitimate context fit. The record was closed. The matter was closed. The guards had not drawn weapons. There was no longer any reason to draw them. Arev Thon looked at his daughter. Sylira was looking at the authorization string on page 19. Her face was doing something that took him a moment to identify. She was not convinced. Not by the answer, not by the fit of it, not by the way the legitimate context had appeared so readily and so completely. She was looking at the string the way she had looked at the beacon analysis in the landing bay 3 days ago, not at the object itself but at the conditions surrounding it. The Eastern Channel processed both documents, she said. It was not a question. Correct, Vesic said. The patrol configuration request and the Somara maintenance resolution. She was still looking at the page. Both routed through the Eastern Channel. Both carrying that string. She looked up. What else moved through the Eastern Channel in the 18 days bracketing the Somara incident? Vesic said, that would require a full archive review, which Mari Du has the archive, Sylira said. She's been sitting with it for 3 hours. A silence. It was the silence of a room in which a question had been asked that a legitimate explanation should be able to answer instantly, and had not. Arev Thon heard it the way he heard the absence of the 7th bell, not as a sound, but as the shape of where a sound should have been. Vesic said, Mari Du is not authorized to conduct an independent archive review without. She's the second chancellor, Arev Thon said. She reports outside your clearance tier. The review itself requires. Why does it fit? Marcus said. His hands were still flat on the table. His voice had not risen. He was looking at Vesik with the patient attention of a man who has asked this question before in other rooms about other things, and has learned to ask it quietly because the volume was never the point. The Eastern Channel explanation fits the authorization string on the Somara record, Marcus said. And it fits the patrol configuration request. And it fits the timing. Fits everything. He paused. That's what I mean. Why does a legitimate administrative coincidence fit the specific pattern that places a human vessel at exactly the right distance to serve as an incursion craft, in exactly the right window for the incident to make that credible, with exactly the right maintenance vulnerability already marked closed so it wouldn't draw inspection? Each piece has a legitimate explanation. Each explanation fits perfectly. The whole thing fits. He looked at Vesik. That's not evidence that it's innocent. That's evidence that someone very careful built it to fit. The guards' hands had moved to their weapons. It had happened without order, the instinctive response of men trained to respond to destabilizing statements with positional authority. 2 of them had drawn. 2 had not but would. Marcus did not look at the weapons. He looked at Vesik and waited, hands flat, face still. Arev Thon watched him and understood something about the quality of that stillness. Marcus was not defending himself, not explaining himself further, not attempting to exit the room. He had asked the question that could not be answered by reconciliation, and he was simply sitting in the silence where the answer should have been. Arev Thon had seen men argue in rooms like this, had seen them press advantage and explain their own correctness. This was different. This was someone who had already done the work and was now waiting to find out if the room would do its own. Vesik said, "You cannot trace intent from convenience." "No," Marcus said. "But I can trace the authorization string." Arev Thon moved to the secondary communications panel. Silira was already there. He did not ask her to step aside. He reached past her and opened the channel himself. The administrative bypass, the provision from 2 reigns prior, the door he knew because he had read the charter, and Marit Du's voice came through before the tone had finished. "Majesty, tired, sharp, entirely awake. I had expected this call 4 hours earlier. You reviewed the archive access logs. I reviewed the Kelvin Reach patrol configuration when Analyst Juvitha's relocation request came through my office. I read the file that prompted the relocation. I have been sitting with the authorization string from the patrol configuration for 3 hours. A pause, not dramatic, administrative, the pause of someone confirming a fact before stating it. I have also been sitting with something else. The Eastern Channel processed 47 documents during the 18-day window bracketing the Somara incident. The authorization string that appears on the patrol configuration request appears on 1 other document in that set. 1. The Somara maintenance resolution, Silira said. A silence on the channel. Yes. How did you know that? Because it fits, Silira said. She was looking at Vesik. Everything about it fits. And the question is why the legitimate explanation and the explanation we're trying to prove require exactly the same signature, on exactly those 2 documents out of 47. Vesik said, from across the room, Marit Du the Eastern Channel processed both documents. This is a matter of administrative routing. Not. The maintenance record was processed through the Eastern Channel, Marit Du said. But the Somara maintenance record was not an Eastern Channel document by origin. It originated in fleet engineering logistics. The Eastern Channel does not have routing jurisdiction over fleet engineering logistics. For the authorization string to appear on that document, someone with Eastern clearance applied it manually, to a record that had no business being in the Eastern Channel at all. Another pause. I've been looking for the legitimate administrative context that would explain this for 3 hours. I haven't found one. I don't believe one exists. The guards who had drawn weapons were still holding them. The guards who had not drawn were looking at Vesik. Vesik said nothing. He was looking at the folded document he had placed on the table. Arev Thon could not read what was happening in his face except that it was not the face of a man who had been surprised. It was the face of a man who had run a calculation many times and arrived at the same answer each time and had been hoping this room would produce a different one. He had closed the maintenance record because his mind required closure. He had applied his clearest tool to the problem. The Eastern Channel was legitimate, the routing explanation was legitimate, the administrative coincidence was legitimate, and had not seen that the tool left a record of its own application. The Eastern Channel was not supposed to touch fleet engineering logistics. That the string appeared there was not evidence of a cover story. It was evidence of the action itself. The session calendar, Scylyra said. She had moved to stand beside the table rather than beside the panel, and Arev Thon had not noticed when. 11 days, 12 from the archive review. He needs the Eastern Seal physically placed before the Border Council convenes, or the session cannot ratify a war posture under emergency provision. She was looking at her father. He needs you out of reach for 3 days. Vesic said quietly, what I need is irrelevant. What the border situation requires is a resolved posture. Without the ratification session, the fleet holds an unresolved configuration that leaves the Eastern Reach. He's going to explain why the war is necessary, Marcus said. He was still sitting, hands still flat, watching Vesic with the patient exhaustion of a man who has heard versions of this before. That's the next part. It's a good explanation. Some of it is probably true. Vesic looked at him. Some of it is entirely true. The human border incursions over the prior decade. Some of it is true, Marcus said again. Something in his voice closed the sentence in a way that made continuing it feel like answering a question that had already been answered. He turned to the king. The authorization string on page 19 traced to its source. I need it read aloud in a chamber where it cannot be disputed later. And I need it done before he finds the gap in his own case. He already looked for the gap, Scylyra said. He's been looking since the archive review. He used the Eastern Channel explanation. It was the best answer he had. She looked at Vesic. You thought it would hold. Vesic said nothing. Lower your weapons, Arev Thon said. The guards looked at Vesic. Vesic, after a moment, made the gesture. They lowered them. Arev Thon stood very still for 3 seconds, which was all he could afford. Mari Du's voice was still open on the channel. The authorization records were under chancellery seal, physical copies, locked at the 5th bell by a woman who had run the same numbers and arrived at the same room without being asked. Marcus was sitting at the table with his hands flat and his documentation spread in front of him. His face carried something that was not quite relief and not quite vindication and not quite grief, but contained elements of all three. Mari Du, Arev Thon said. Secure the authorization records under chancellery seal. Physical copies. My voice authorization to follow in writing within the hour. Admit no access requests through any channel until I am physically present. Already done, Majesty. I sealed them at the 5th bell. He closed the channel. He turned to Orith 7. The council chamber. First session. Full attendance, no exceptions. He picked up the pages from the table himself, stacked them with the care appropriate to evidence and not to reading material, and tucked them under his arm. He held out his hand for the data chip. Marcus picked it up, held it for a half-second, the grip of someone returning a thing they have carried a long time, and placed it in the king's palm. He looked at Vesic. You'll be present. Vesic met his eyes. Of course, Majesty. His voice had settled into something even and cool, a man who had not surrendered his posture with his explanation. The council should hear the complete case. I look forward to presenting the context the documentation does not contain. It was, Arev Thon thought, exactly the right thing to say. Vesic was not broken. He was already constructing the next room. Across the table, Marcus had gone still in a different way. Not the stillness of someone waiting to act, but the stillness of someone who had heard that sentence before or one like it and was noting its structure. He did not say anything. He was watching Vesic the way a man watches a door. He knows from its dimensions what it opens onto. Arev Thon thought of something then. He had asked his commanders once, 2 years ago, why the human's descent record had terminated his service rather than redirected it. The answer had been that a scout who deviated from route assignments without authorization was a liability to fleet coordination. Arev Thon had accepted this. It was administratively sound. It was the kind of answer that had a shape to it, that accounted for the question. He had not asked why the descent record existed in the first place, what cases Marcus had filed against, whether any of those cases had been reviewed and found to have merit. He had not asked because the file had a shape and the shape had satisfied him. He looked at the man across the table, the cup of cold liquid, the scratch on the data chip now in his own hand, the 30 pages under his arm. Tell me what you need, Arev Thon said. Marcus's breath released on account. For seconds, controlled, a man who had been holding a great deal and was choosing very carefully how to set it down. The authorization string traced to its source. Read aloud where it can't be disputed. And Vesic in the room when it happens. A pause. He'll have a counter-explanation ready. It will be a good one. You need to hear what it explains and then ask why it explains exactly that. He already knows the documentation exists, Silira said. She said it to her father, not to Marcus. He's known since the archive access. His counter-explanation is already built. She looked at Marcus. He'll be right about some of it. Marcus said, yes. And you'll ask the second test question anyway. Yes. They left the room together. The king with the pages under his arm and the data chip in his hand. His daughter at his shoulder. The human 2 steps behind. And Vesic walking at his own measured pace at the rear. The eastern corridor was cold and the light was flat and the morning was coming. Somewhere in the administrative wing, the second chancellor was sitting with 47 documents and 1 anomalous authorization and the sealed certainty that no legitimate context would arrive to explain it. She was not wrong. Mark down. The council chamber had no windows. Arev Thon had always considered this a virtue. Decisions made here should not be diluted by weather or light. Now, standing at the head of the long table while the 9 remaining council members found their seats. He understood that he had been wrong about that too. Vesic arrived last. He was unhurried. He set his folio on the table with the practiced ease of a man who had spent 3 years arranging furniture in rooms before anyone else entered them. Arev Thon watched his face run the arithmetic. 9 members present. Marate due in the anteroom with sealed documents. No Eastern authorization on the table. Vesic's eyes did not flicker to the empty chair where the Eastern delegate would have sat. That was its own data point. Chancellor Vesic, Arev Thon said. He did not sit. Vesic looked up. Something moved behind his expression. A man reviewing a building he designed, checking whether his exits were still where he'd placed them. My king, I was told this session was called on emergency provision. It was. Then the Eastern border authorization is no longer the question before this council. The room changed pressure the way rooms do when 11 people simultaneously recalculate. Arev Thon laid the Marate due documents on the table with both hands and stepped back. He did not read from them. Silira had spent the pre-dawn hours teaching him that the worst thing he could do was perform the evidence rather than present it. She had been right about nearly everything for 3 years without him adequately noticing. The maintenance flag on the Somara's reactor housing was marked resolved on the 14th day of the 3rd month, 3 years ago, he said. 19 days before the incident. The authorization string resolving that flag belongs to a clearance tier that only 3 members of this council hold. He paused. 2 of those members were off-station at the time. The archive access was made through an off-log channel that bypasses standard record in all respects save one. The cryptographic signature cannot be retroactively removed without generating a timestamp discrepancy. Vesic's folio was open on the table. Arev Thon noticed he was not looking at it. He was looking at Marate Du's sealed envelope and calculating its weight. My king, Vesic said. His voice was measured, and the measure itself was a kind of answer. Maintenance resolutions are processed through administrative review. I cannot account for. The timestamp mismatch is 14 seconds. Arev Thon's voice did not rise. The flag was resolved and then resolved again. The second resolution is what the public record shows. The 14-second gap is where the first resolution was replaced. He had expected Vesic to move toward argument. That was the shape of most confrontations, each party constructing a case, the room adjudicating between them. What Vesic did instead was look at the documents for a long, still moment. He had the expression of a man who has found the leak in his own roof. Arev Thon recognized it. He had worn something like it himself, standing over Juvitha's debris report 3 mornings ago, feeling the floor change material underfoot. The difference was that Arev Thon had let the floor change. Vesic's jaw set. Then Vesic opened his folio. He had prepared for this. Not for this exact configuration of the room, 9 members, Marate Du sealed documents, no Eastern delegate, but for the category of event it represented. He produced a single page and laid it on the table with a steadiness that cost him something. He did not look at Arevthon when he spoke. The Somara's reactor error log, Vesic said, documents a cascade failure in the housing subsystem's logging protocol on the 13th day of the 3rd month, 1 day before the maintenance resolution your documents cite. He let that sit for a moment. The cascade failure produced duplicate processing artifacts across 17 administrative records in the same clearance tier. The second resolution that Mar8-Du's timestamp identifies is the authoritative resolution. The first was a logging artifact. Administrative law is clear. When a cascade failure generates duplicate entries, the later entry supersedes. The 14-second gap is the logging system correcting itself. He looked at Arevthon now. I cannot account for why Mar8-Du did not surface this document alongside the others. I can only note that without it, the picture is incomplete. The room did not change pressure this time. The room went very still. Arevthon looked at the page. The cascade failure was documented. The dates aligned. The explanation was not implausible. It was, if anything, the kind of explanation that satisfied because it contained sufficient technical texture to feel like the truth. He became aware that he was looking for the shape of closure. He recognized the feeling. The cascade failure report. Xylira's voice came from the far end of the table. Arevthon had asked her to stand with counsel as witness, not participant, and she had not spoken until now. She was looking at the page Vesic had produced, not at Vesic. Who filed it? Vesic looked at her. The station's maintenance administrator. The maintenance administrator whose access logs are the ones under review. Whose access logs are one of 3 under review, yes. A cascade failure that affected 17 records, Xylira said. In the same clearance tier. In the same 2-day window. Filed by the same administrator whose authorization signature appears on the resolution in question. She did not raise her voice. She had her father's quality of not needing to. That is not an explanation, Chancellor. That is another tidy conclusion. You have replaced one convenient document trail with a second convenient document trail, and the second one has the same shape as the first. Administrative law. Administrative law describes what to do when cascade failures produce duplicate records. It does not tell us whether this cascade failure occurred. She looked at him steadily. You have given us a reason the 14-second gap is innocent. You have not given us a reason the cascade failure report was filed by the person whose authorization is at the center of this inquiry. Filed 1 day before the maintenance resolution, and never cross-referenced in the original investigation. She paused. The original investigation, which I will note your office administered. Vesic said nothing. The second test, Xylira said, quietly, mostly to herself, the way someone names a tool they are already using. The explanation is convenient in exactly the same direction as the thing it explains. Marcus, watching from the anteroom through the cracked door. He had not been invited into the chamber, and he had not asked. But no one had told him to close the door, heard that, and did not move. He had been prepared to say something close to that. He had the words formed. He had not needed them. Arevthon set Vesic's cascade failure page beside Mar8-Du's documents and looked at both of them for a long moment. Maintenance resolutions of this kind are under administrative review, Vesic said. The sentence had the quality of a structure he was maintaining because he did not yet know what to replace it with. Not criminal. This council does not have jurisdiction to. This council has my voice, Arevthon said, and I am using it. He had not been invited into the chamber, and he had not asked. Xylira had explained the protocol with the matter-of-fact precision she'd developed for delivering information to someone who would find it either infuriating or irrelevant. Foreign nationals, even exonerated ones, did not address the Kasorath full council. They provided documents. The documents spoke for them. His documents were already inside. He was outside, on a stone bench that was too narrow for his frame, listening to muffled voices resolve into muffled silence and trying to remember the last time he'd eaten a full meal. The door had been cracked open by the shift of air when the 9th council member entered. No one had closed it. He had not moved it further. He had not moved at all. He could feel the navigation fragment's absence from his jacket pocket the way you feel a missing tooth with your tongue. 3 years of carrying it. The timestamp on that log had become so familiar that he'd stopped actually reading the numbers, had just felt the weight of the chip and known it was there. Now it was in an evidence envelope somewhere on that table, and his jacket pocket was lighter than his body remembered it being. Sylira came out 20 minutes after the silence started. She moved like someone who had been prepared for a longer fight and was recalibrating for the actual distance. She sat down on the bench beside him. There was barely room. She made room, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Vesic," Marcus said. "Vesic." She exhaled slowly. He admitted to the administrative action. He called it protective intervention. He presented a brief. He had prepared one, I think, for a version of this where he had more time, arguing that the Somara incident, while not as the record showed, served a unifying function that 3 years of subsequent policy had validated. Marcus absorbed this. He argued the lie worked so it should stand. He argued that undoing the conclusion would cost more than the conclusion had. She looked at the far wall. He was not wrong about the cost. He was wrong to have made it our only option. What happened? My father stripped his title, sealed his office, and ordered a border commission. She paused. He also ordered the Eastern authorization removed from the council calendar until the commission reports. Marcus thought about the consolidation faction, the stakeholders, the career officers for whom 3 years of hostile border policy had not been a tragedy but a portfolio. "That commission is going to be long," he said. "Yes." Sylira looked at her hands. She had ink on 3 fingers from the pre-dawn document work, and she hadn't cleaned it off. It will be long, and it will be inconclusive at points, and there will be people on it who would prefer inconclusive. That is different from what we had this morning. It is not different from what I had hoped. He turned to look at her. She was watching the wall with the focused distance of someone running a calculation she hadn't finished yet. "You're already applying the second test," he said. "To the commission structure?" "Yes." She glanced at him. 3 of the 7 proposed members were appointed during Vesic's administrative tenure. That is probably coincidence. It is suspiciously tidy coincidence. Flag it. "I intend to." She straightened. "You'll want to know about the Eastern Garden." He had not expected to be taken there. He had not expected anything beyond the document surrender and a formal escort to whatever transport the Kasorath considered appropriate for exonerated foreign nationals. He had been preparing himself for the long version of that, the form, the processing, the handoff to Claire Whitmore at some neutral station who would ask him exhausted questions in a small room. The Eastern Garden was so far from that shape that, for a moment, he simply stood in the doorway and did not move. The vines had grown back unevenly. 3 years of sealed maintenance meant the northern wall was denser, the trellis on the east side broken in one place and repaired with something newer and slightly different in color. A stone path ran through the center of it, and at the path's end, facing the interior, a Rev Thon stood with his back to the door. Sylira touched Marcus's shoulder and left him there. He walked in slowly, partly because it seemed appropriate, and partly because the paving stones were uneven and he'd had approximately 4 hours of sleep in 48 and his body was making its objections through his ankles and knees. The garden smelled like something he couldn't identify. Cool stone and something floral and something underneath that was just old, the way places smell when they've been closed a long time and the air has settled. He stopped 6 feet from the king and waited. A Rev Thon did not turn immediately. When he did, Marcus was struck again, as he'd been struck the first time briefly in the sealed room, by how old the grief had made him look, and by the different thing that was in his face now. Grief wearing through to something underneath. Not its opposite, just its next shape. "Your commanders," a Rev Thon said. "In your record, the formal notation." It was not phrased as a question, but it was one. "Third time I flagged a tidy conclusion," Marcus said. "Colonel Hale called it institutional friction. He wasn't wrong. I cost the unit 3 days on 2 separate investigations. The conclusions were wrong? One was. One wasn't." A Rev Thon was quiet for a moment. He looked at the broken trellis on the east wall. "When Sylira was brought back," he said, "you could have used that. The rescue. Built a different kind of leverage from it. I had the navigation fragment. You had something more than a navigation fragment. You had my daughter." He said it without accusation, testing the shape of the sentence. Any other man would have led with that. Marcus thought about this carefully. He owed the king careful thinking. The fragment was cleaner, he finally said. Leverage built on Sylira would have worked or it wouldn't, depending on how you felt about her in that moment, what it cost you to see her, whether you believed the rescue was real or staged. There are too many variables. He shifted his weight. A timestamp is a timestamp. I led with what I could prove. Arev Thon looked at him with an expression Marcus had no framework for, evaluating and something else, something that was recognition without familiarity, like finding a word in another language for something you'd always felt but never named. Vesic understood what he was doing, Arev Thon said. He understood how I think. He built something my mind would accept as finished. Yes. That understanding it does not become less accurate because he used it against me. He said this carefully, as though the sentence had weight he was distributing as he carried it. I do think in terms of closed evidence. I do close inquiries when the shape fits. Marcus said nothing. It was not his place to agree or to reassure. My daughter does not do this anymore, Arev Thon continued. She has not done it, I think, for some time. I had read it as the damage of her years in the border system, as something that had been knocked loose. He stopped. The vine against the north wall moved slightly in a draft from somewhere. I should like to ask you something directly. Go ahead. Can it be learned, or only sustained in people who already have it? It was a better question than Marcus had expected. He stood with it for a moment. The paving stones under his feet were not quite level. He could feel the slight tilt in his left heel. I don't know, he said. I've never been able to turn mine off. I've tried. He paused and left it there. Arev Thon was quiet for a long moment. Then, she is going to be very difficult to govern with. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but a line where one might eventually form, like a crack in stone that shows where water has begun finding its way. She was going to be that anyway, Marcus said. The king looked at him with an expression that was something much more interesting than amusement. He looked at Marcus the way Marcus had been looked at, twice in his career, by officers who had watched him flag the convenient answer and had understood afterward, in the wake of the investigation, why that specific friction had been worth every slow hour of it. Not warmth, not gratitude. Something closer to a man revising the category he'd placed a phenomenon into, not friend, not instrument, not alien curiosity, but something that required its own taxonomy. I do not know the correct protocol, Arev Thon said, for what I am about to say to you. I don't either, Marcus said. Say it anyway. Arev Thon was quiet for a long moment. Then, I owe you a different kind of debt than the one for Sylira's return. Her return is a thing I can name. I can mark it, weight it, find its shape. His voice was even and careful and doing work. The other thing, the thing your record documents across your career at professional cost. I cannot weight it. It has no clean shape. It is the reason I still have a daughter and the reason the Somara inquiry will be reopened and the reason Vesic could not finish what he built. He paused. I cannot find a form for that debt. Marcus thought about Hale's notation. Institutional friction. 3 days lost. The second investigation that had not been wrong, the conclusion that had been right all along. And the way Hale had looked at him across a table in that small room like a man watching someone damage good work for the pleasure of it. You don't owe me for the mechanism, Marcus said. I'd have applied it to a case that helped me just as fast. You're not in debt to my integrity. You ran into it by accident. Arev Thon held his gaze for a moment, and then he nodded, once, the way decisions are made rather than the way courtesy is performed. The Border Commission will need advisors, he said, outside the normal clearance tiers. People without a stake in either existing conclusion. Marcus understood what was being extended and what it would cost him to take it. Whitmore would have opinions. Hale was retired, but his successor would have opinions. His own service record would have to absorb another annotation, another formal notation in the language of institutional friction. And the years he spent on a Kasorath commission advising on border policy would sit in his file as something that did not resolve cleanly into standard categories. He thought about this for approximately 3 seconds. I'll need my navigation fragment back, he said. Evidence in active proceedings. I will see to it. And a secure channel to Colonel Whitmore. She'll want to be furious at me before she agrees to anything. That can be arranged. And Marcus said, because the paving stones were still not level under his left foot, and he was tired and had nothing left to lose by asking. Something to eat. Anything. Edible is the only requirement. Arev Thon's face did the thing again. The line where the smile had begun finding its way. He turned toward the door. Marcus fell into step beside him. And they walked out of the eastern garden together through the morning.